You've just been given an awesome action scene with punches, whooshes, gunshots, all kinds of stuff that requires big, bold sound. And when you go to look through your library, all you find are small recordings, things that sound rather wimpy. You bought some library that promised big punches, and it didn't deliver. Today in this video, I'm going to be walking you through how to take quote-unquote normal, simple, small recordings and how to beef them up to give you big Hollywood impact. Not every recording straight from the microphone is going to sound big and impactful like you hear in the movies and TV shows. But don't worry, because the process to get from that point to one that sounds like a Hollywood sound effect actually isn't that difficult once you know the steps to take. I'm going to break it down for you. Let's get to it. Okay, here we are in Pro Tools. I've got 3 sounds that I've chosen ahead of time. I'm going to play each of them for you and show you what it is that we're working with, and then we're going to turn them into bigger, badder sounds that will do great in an action sequence. Okay, so the first one is this punch recording. Sounds kind of like a regular punch that you would get if you were to do that in front of a microphone. Next we have a gunshot. It's okay. It's kind of bright. It's kind of small. It's not necessarily impactful. And then for a different kind of sound, we've got this. Kind of this metal latch sound. Could be a gun loading, could be a latch to a gate, who knows. We're going to punch each of these up, and I'm going to walk you through the process. The first thing to understand about big punchy sounds versus the recordings that we get straight out of our microphones is the difference between peak volume and RMS volume, or in other words, the average volume over time. Peak volume is momentary. It's an extremely short fraction of a second that measures the moment-to-moment volume of your sound. The thing is, you can have a very high peak volume and a very wimpy sounding recording. But you could have a lower peak with a higher RMS and have a much bigger, beefier sound. The reason for that is the way that we perceive sound. Small momentary fractions of a second doesn't equate to what we call punch or impact in our sound effects. The longer the sustain of volume in a sound effect, the bigger it's going to be perceived. And we can achieve increasing the RMS value of our recordings through a few different processes. So I'm going to walk you through each of these sound effects and see how it goes. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do here on each of these sounds is I'm going to start with EQ. I've got Pro Q4 pulled open here. Let me show you so here's the before, and here's the after Pro Q. I'm basically just, it's a very bright sound. I'm just carving out some top end. I'm also going to be filtering out the really low lows. Nothing below 40 Hertz is going to be useful to us in this sort of thing, not for something like a punch. One of the quickest and best ways to punch up our sounds is to use distortion. I'm going to use the Black Box HG2. This is one of my favorite plugins. I actually own the hardware unit. It's fantastic for adding beef and distortion to a sound. So here it is before, and here it is after. Immediately you can hear the difference. I've basically added saturation to the low end, I've beefed up both of the tubes that it's running through, and I've increased the output just a little bit. Then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to EQ again, because what it did is it introduced a little bit of boxiness, and I also want to add more thump. So I'm rolling off a little bit more of the top end. What tends to happen in some of these recordings is when you start to compress them, when you start to add distortion, a lot of times the tails will bring up hiss and other noise we don't want. So I'm just taming that down a little bit. I'm getting rid of some of the boxy midtones, and I'm increasing the low end. So here it is before, here it is after. Okay, so it's actually fairly subtle. Then I'm going to be running it through Maxim. This is a built-in plugin that comes for free with Pro Tools. This is a maximizing limiter. Basically, we take down the threshold and it increases the RMS value of our sound. And I'm setting the ceiling at -2 so that that is the loudest peak that's going to output from the plugin. So here it is before, here it is after. Significantly louder. So we've crushed the peak, but we're creating more sustain, and more sustain is perceived as loudness. Then what I'm doing is I'm actually because we've brought it up to -2, there's not a whole lot more room to go. So I'm actually going to trim this total volume back down by 4 using the trim tool, again, included in Pro Tools. And then I'm going to use Plugin Alliance's SPL Transient Designer, and I'm adding quite a bit of attack here. So here it is without and with. So essentially what I'm doing here is I've taken this small peak, we've squashed it down into something much fatter, and then I'm lowering that overall so that I leave enough room to then push up just the peak again, which gives sort of that initial smack or that initial peak. So I just want you guys to see the waveform. What I'm going to do is I'm going to commit, and we're going to see the before and after on the actual waveform. So if I increase the width here, what you can see, this peak is a little bit more rounded off, and that's because of the limiting and the distortion we've done, but there's a much bigger tail here. So that is increasing the average loudness of our clip, therefore resulting in something that is perceived as louder. So here it is with all of the plugins bypassed. Here's the before, and here's the after. Pretty simple, right? Okay, so we're going to do it again with this gunshot, and I'm going to walk through it a little quicker this time, now that we understand some of the concepts of distortion, limiting, and EQ. There's our gunshot again, very bright. So what I've done here is rolled off some top end. I've taken out a little bit of what is going to end up being like a boxy tone, this kind of like low mid range here between 250 to like 500 hertz is very boxy sounding. And then I've tried to increase significantly the low end of it. So here's before, here's after. It's already helping. Now Decapitator, this is by Sound Toys. This is another one of my favorite distortion tools. I've increased the drive to 5, which is a fair amount. I'm lowering the tone to dark just a little bit, and then I'm rolling off just a tiny bit of the high cut here, and then we'll see what that sounds like. So before, after. Okay, I could go even further on the drive here. Break it. Okay, so I think it was safer somewhere down here, just because if we increase the overall volume too much, if we create too much sustain, it doesn't leave room for punch in the beginning. We do want the initial transient to hit harder than the body of the sound if we want that sense of punch and impact. So I'm going to lower that just a little bit, back down to 6, and leave it there. It's still a little crunchy, so that's good. Next, this is one of my favorite subharmonic generators. This is called Low Ender by Refuse. What I've done is increased the gate on it so that it only is going to bring in the bass once the threshold is exceeded, and then I'll take it back away once it goes back down. And we've got the output set to 0, and the bass versus the direct is set somewhere like 75%. So that adds a significant amount of low end. Here's before and after. That sounds awesome. Now we're going to use FabFilter's Pro L2. This is a wonderful limiter. Again, I'm just pushing into it at +2 and subtracting at -2. So essentially, I'm pushing into it and increasing the gain by 2, but I'm decreasing the gain by 2 on the output. So we actually are ending up with the same value by the end, but what it's going to do is it's going to control those peaks and cut them off at -2 so that we're not clipping. And you'll see it's actually on the peak there, it's doing a significant amount of limiting. And that's good. And then the last thing I did was hit this with one more EQ. This is sort of subtle curves based on things I heard. So I'm taking down just a little bit of this low thing that probably got a little too excited. I'm actually increasing a little bit of this low mid for warmth. And then I'm pulling down a little bit of the mid range, the high, and a little bit of a resonant frequency up top. So here we are. Here's this clip all the way from 0 with no plugins. And here it is after. Big difference. Okay, last one down here. Here's our metal latch sound. Okay, here's some EQ, adding a bit of low end, rolling off some top end, dulling it up. Then with Saturn, I've got this set to clean tube, And I'm turning this up quite a bit. This is up to 72%. And this dynamics feature right here kind of acts like a compressor. So when you turn this up to the right clockwise, it does a bit of compression and it already starts to create that louder RMS value for us. So before and after. Then I'm using Elastic Z-plane pitch. And what I'm doing essentially is I've got the dry wet set to about 40% here. And I am just lowering this whole thing by an octave. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the thinner sound up top. I'm essentially duplicating it, right? Using this by setting the dry wet to 40% and bringing it down an octave. I'm essentially shifting the sound down an octave and layering it underneath so that we have a little bit more bottom end to work with. So here it is without and with. So you can hear that added warmth in there. And then this is one of my favorite limiting kind of sound shaping design tools. This is Uber Loud by Boom. Essentially, this is a limiter. It starts like this. But if we put it in 3-band mode, what it allows us to do is sort of treat it almost like an EQ limiter, like a multi-band. So we can push the low end, and I'm pushing a little bit of top end. You can control the crossovers here. These are default values. And then what's nice is, like I said before, sometimes when you crush a sound and you limit it, you end up bringing up a lot of the noise floor and the quiet tail, and it gives hiss and stuff. So they have this really useful denoise feature here that you can turn up, and it suppresses some of that added noise in the tail. So here it is before, and here it is after. You can hear it gives a bit of low rumble. I'm not doing too much to it here. It's also got these character modes. If you do push or stress, it'll add more distortion. So here it is on nice mode. Here it is on stress for the extreme. I think it sounds fine with stress. We'll leave it there. Then I'm using Spiff. Spiff is a really cool sort of spectral transient designer. What Spiff allows you to do is to essentially select the range of frequency that you want to boost and create more transients for. So I'm giving a big punch to the low end, and then I'm adding just a touch up here on the high end. And I've got this set pretty high at 5.7. The sensitivity's turned up, and I've also increased the decay a little bit. The decay is literally the decay of the punch that it's adding. So the longer the decay, the more the punch that it's adding sustains. So here it is without and with. So you can hear, especially on the second transient, it's adding a bit more of a punch. And then I'm using Clipper by Kilohertz. A clipper is kind of like a limiter, except instead of just reducing sounds at the top, once you exceed the threshold, it literally just cuts it off. And you'll actually see that visual when I run it here. So here it is without, and here it is with. The effect that cutting those peaks has is it not only adds to the RMS value by reducing peak values, but it also adds in its own flavor of distortion, and that's very helpful for creating punchy big sounds. And then I did a touch of EQ at the end again. I'm actually expanding low end upwards. This is sort of similar to how Spiff works. And then I'm reducing a bit of a low mid frequency that built up here, and then reducing some of the harsher high mids that got added in the process. So before, after. Okay, so now here it is with all the plugins disabled and with. And that's a lot punchier. So again, in order to take sort of quote unquote normal sounding sounds that have high peak values but low RMS, we're going to use a combination of tools. And I urge you to just play around, use different plugins. You don't have to use the ones I used. Use a combination of distortion, compression, limiting. A clipper is a great tool if you can get your hands on one. The one by Kilohertz is excellent, and transient designers. If you use some combination of these tools to help increase the RMS level of your signal while decreasing some of the peaks, you will achieve an overall louder and therefore punchier sound. And make sure you're using EQ along the way to help compensate for some of the things that are being brought up and down in your signal, and you'll wind up with something that sounds more like a Hollywood sound effect. I hope you learned something from this video. Thank you so much for watching. If it helped you out in any way, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know down in the comments what your favorite tools are and what sort of content you'd like to see from me in the future. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.